It was 1997, a year that started out like a dream come true. I had just landed a fantastic new job, and with it, I was finally able to move my wife and our two daughters into a bigger, better house. Life felt perfect. To celebrate, we decided to stick to our tradition of camping out in the woods, something we did every time we had something big to celebrate. My girls loved it. They'd look forward to it for weeks, packing their little bags and talking about the adventures they'd have. I remember that day clearly. We packed up the car we had rented for the trip. Right away, something felt off about it. Sometimes it would speed up on its own, or the steering would jerk in a direction I wasn't turning. I'd been driving since 1975, so I knew my way around a car. But this one, it was different. I even thought about swapping it for another, but the girls had already fallen in love with it, and the thought of going through the rental process again was too much hassle. So I convinced myself it was all in my head and set off. We didn't arrive at the forest until around 6 p.m. The place was beautiful, just as I remembered it. The trees were tall and dense, their leaves creating a canopy above us that filtered the light in a way that made everything feel almost magical. The girls were out of the car in a flash, running off to explore, while my wife and I started setting up the tent. We wanted to get everything ready before it got dark. But then, out of nowhere, the weather changed. The sky grew dark, and a thick fog began to roll in. It was so dense we could barely see a foot in front of us. The air grew cold and heavy, and strange sounds began to echo through the trees. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet we were used to. It was oppressive, filled with an uneasy silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's when we realized the girls were missing. They had been playing just a moment ago, but now they were nowhere to be seen. Panic set in. My wife and I called out their names, our voices sounding small and lost in the fog. The fear gnawed at me, a deep primal terror that something was very, very wrong. And then, from the car, something emerged. It was translucent, almost ghostly, with long, skeletal fingers and a face obscured by shadows. It moved towards us, and then, as if noticing our terror, it changed direction, heading straight for where we thought our daughters might be. My heart was pounding. Fear was overwhelming. I shouted for the girls, running blindly into the fog after that thing, hoping against hope that we'd find them in time. The forest, which had seemed so inviting just moments before, now felt like a maze of shadows and whispers. My wife and I pushed through the thick fog, our calls for our daughters echoing back at us like taunts. Each step felt heavier, the ground beneath us seeming to pull us down as if the forest itself was trying to swallow us whole. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent shivers down my spine. I could feel the presence of that thing that had come from the car, lurking somewhere in the mist, watching us. My heart raced as I thought about my daughters out there, alone with whatever it was. Fog seemed to twist and coil around us, making it hard to tell which way was which. We stumbled through the underbrush, our flashlights barely cutting through the dense fog. My wife clung to my arm, her grip tightening with each eerie sound. We called out again and again, our voices growing hoarse and desperate. The strange sounds we had heard earlier were growing louder now, more insistent. It was like a chorus of whispers, just on the edge of hearing, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of movement. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to see one of my daughters standing there, her eyes wide with fear. She was holding on to her sister, who was crying silently, her little body shaking. Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed sense of urgency. We needed to get out of there. As we gathered our daughters, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Fog seemed to press in closer, the whispers growing louder. I glanced back towards the car, and there it was again, the translucent figure, its long fingers reaching out, as if to grasp us. My blood ran cold. "We have to go now," I shouted, my voice trembling. We started to move as quickly as we could, half dragging, half carrying the girls. My wife kept looking back, her eyes wide with terror. The figure was following us, its movements slow but relentless. We stumbled back towards our campsite, the fog growing thicker with every step. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around us now, filling the air with a cacophony of voices. I could feel the presence of that thing getting closer and closer. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But the forest felt like a trap, closing in on us. Finally, we reached the campsite, and I threw the girls into the car. I could feel the entity's cold breath on my neck as I slammed the door shut and jumped into the driver's seat. The car roared to life, and for a moment, it felt like it was fighting me again. But then, miraculously, it responded, and we sped off into the night, leaving the fog and the whispers behind. Finally, we reached the campsite, and I threw the girls into the car. I could feel the entity's cold breath on my neck as I slammed the door shut and jumped into the driver's seat. The car roared to life, and for a moment, it felt like it was fighting me again. But then, miraculously, it responded, and we sped off into the night, leaving the fog and the whispers behind. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Fog was receding, but I could still see that figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us with those empty, shadowed eyes. A shiver ran down my spine. We had escaped, but I knew that whatever had haunted us in that forest wasn't finished with us yet. The drive back felt like a fever dream. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, knuckles white with the intensity of my grip. My wife sat beside me, holding our daughters close, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The girls were silent, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. Forest loomed behind us, dark and ominous, as if it was watching us leave. We didn't speak. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from the girls. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every flicker of light from the passing trees felt like a ghostly presence trying to catch up. I pushed the car faster, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. Hours later, we finally reached home. It should have been a relief, a safe haven from the horrors we had just experienced. But as we stepped inside, the sense of unease clung to us, like a second skin. The house, which had always felt warm and inviting, now seemed cold and alien. The shadows in the corners felt deeper, the silence heavier. We put the girls to bed, each of them clutching a stuffed animal as if it could ward off the nightmares. My wife and I collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted to speak. The events of the night replayed in my mind on a relentless loop. Fog, the whispers, that thing with its long skeletal fingers, all felt surreal, like a twisted nightmare we couldn't wake up from. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of whispers. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. But the whispers were real, low and insistent, filling the room with their eerie cadence. I looked over at my wife, who was still asleep, her face twisted in a frown. Slowly, I got up and followed the sound. It led me to the living room window, where I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just outside, was the translucent figure. It stood motionless, its face still shrouded in shadow, fingers twitching slightly. It was the same entity from the forest, and it had followed us home. Panic gripped me as I backed away from the window. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, filling my head with a sense of dread. I ran to the bedroom and shook my wife awake, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. "It's here," I said, my heart pounding. "Followed us." She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. We hurried to the girls' room, finding them still asleep, their faces calm despite the terror that had invaded our home. I could feel the entity's presence, pressing in on us, suffocating us with its malevolence. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, the lights on, hoping that the dawn would chase away the shadows. But as the first light of morning crept through the windows, I knew that this was far from over. That thing, whatever it was, had marked us. It had followed us out of the forest, and now it was here, in our home. The days that followed felt like a waking nightmare, each moment steeped in dread. The house, which once embraced us with warmth, had turned into a dark labyrinth of fear. We tried to keep up appearances, to go through the motions of normal life, but every creak, every flicker of shadow seemed to whisper threats, wrapping us in an invisible shroud of terror. It was as though we were living in the clutches of a malevolent presence, and escape felt like a distant dream. Our daughters were the first to show signs of the horror that had seeped into our lives. Night after night, they woke up screaming, their small bodies trembling as they spoke of seeing the ghost man in their room. I would hold them close, whispering empty reassurances that I knew were lies. The exhaustion was relentless, dragging us into a pit of despair and making every day a battle for sanity. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, the air was heavy with an unspoken fear. The girls barely touched their food, their eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to leap out from the shadows. My wife and I exchanged worried glances, the silence between us filled with the oppressive weight of our shared dread. The whispers had returned, a low, persistent murmur that seemed to crawl along the edges of our hearing, taunting us with the promise of more horror. Determined to confront the terror head-on, I decided to investigate the source of our suffering. I had to know what we were dealing with, what had turned our lives into a living hell. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, night air biting at my skin. The car, the one that had started it all, sat in the driveway, its presence both a comfort and a curse. As I approached the car, the temperature seemed to drop and the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a sinister fog. I opened the door and slipped inside, the stale scent of mildew filling my nostrils. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing an interior that seemed ordinary at first glance. But then I noticed them. Strange symbols carved crudely into the dashboard, their jagged lines gleaming faintly in the light. My heart pounded in my chest as I traced the symbols with trembling fingers. They felt wrong, as if they were imbued with some dark power. Suddenly, a cold, clammy hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, only the suffocating night and the whispers now growing frenzied and chaotic. I bolted from the car, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The fear was a living thing, crawling up my spine and tightening around my chest. I raced back inside, my mind reeling with the horror of what I had seen. The symbols, the icy grip, the maddening whispers, they all pointed to something ancient and evil, something that had latched onto us with a relentless hunger. I found my wife in the living room, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with worry. I told her about the symbols, cold hand that had touched me, the whispers that had grown louder and more frantic. She clutched the magazine she was reading, her knuckles white as she absorbed the gravity of our situation. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "We need to leave. We need to find somewhere safe." I nodded, my mind racing with the realization that escaping might not be so simple. The entity was tied to that car, to the symbols, and to us. We needed to break free, to sever the connection, or it consumed us completely. That night, as we huddled together in the living room, the whispers turned into a cacophony of tortured voices. They seemed to seep from the walls, the floors, filling the room with their mournful cries. I gripped my wife's hand, the terror gnawing at my insides, knowing that the worst was yet to come. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, a chilling reminder that the darkness we had encountered was far from finished with. The sun rose reluctantly the next morning, casting long, sinister shadows across our home. The light did little to chase away the darkness that had settled into our lives. We tried to make a plan, figure out a way to escape the grip of the malevolent presence that had haunted us. But with every passing hour, the feeling of impending doom grew stronger. My wife and I decided to consult a local historian, hoping that someone might shed light on the origins of the symbols and the ghostly entity that plagued us. We drove to a small town nearby, where an old man named Mr. Dawson had been a historian for decades. His home was cluttered with ancient books and dusty artifacts, the air thick with the scent of old paper and something more unsettling. Mr. Dawson listened intently as we recounted our ordeal, his face growing grave. He took us to a back room and pulled out an old, leather-bound book. As he flipped through its yellowed pages, he muttered to himself, his eyes scanning the text with a sense of urgency. Finally, he looked up, his face ashen. "These symbols," he said, pointing to a drawing in the book, "they are associated with an ancient curse. It said that anyone who encounters these symbols is marked by a vengeful spirit. This spirit feeds on fear and anguish, and once it has chosen its prey, it will torment them until they are driven to madness or death. The words hit us like a punch to the gut. The realization that we were trapped in a nightmare with no escape was almost too much to bear. Mr. Dawson's voice grew softer, more somber. "There's only one way to break the curse," he said. "You need to confront the spirit directly, face the terror it instills, and break the bond it has with you. It won't be easy, and it won't be safe." Determined to end the torment, we returned home and prepared ourselves for the confrontation. That night, we gathered in the living room, the room where the whispers had been the loudest. We lit candles, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls, and placed the symbols from the car in the center of the room, hoping to draw the spirit out. The atmosphere grew heavy with anticipation as we waited. The air grew colder, and the whispers began again, more insistent than ever. My wife and I held each other's hands tightly, our hearts racing as the room seemed to close in on us. Suddenly, temperature dropped sharply, and the figure appeared. It was the same translucent entity we had seen in the forest, its face still obscured by shadows, its long skeletal fingers reaching out. It hovered in the center of the room, bold, oppressive presence that filled the air with a sense of pure malevolence. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, facing the spirit. I could feel its icy gaze piercing through me, and the whispers grew louder, turning into a deafening roar. I shouted out my defiance, my voice trembling but resolute. "You will not control us. We are not afraid anymore." The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers turned into a mournful wail, and the temperature in the room began to rise. The entity let out one final, piercing cry before it dissipated into the shadows, leaving the room in an eerie silence. We were left in the aftermath, the room feeling strangely light, the oppressive weight lifted. We had faced the terror and broken the bond, but the experience had left its mark. The whispers were gone, but the memory of that night would haunt us forever. As we stood in the quiet of the room, we knew we had survived something unspeakable. The curse had been broken, but the scars it left behind were a reminder of the darkness that had once gripped our lives. We had escaped the nightmare, but we would never forget the shadows that had followed us home. In 1988, I was 11 years old. Summer vacations were my favorite because they meant our annual camping trip. Just me and my dad. We had this tradition. Every summer, if my grades were good, we'd pick a new spot, pack our gear, and head out for a weekend in the wild. That year, Dad chose a forest neither of us had been to before. It was known for its dense, almost magical fog that rolled in every night. Drive there was long, winding through narrow roads that seemed to disappear into the trees. The further we went, the more isolated I felt. Cell phones weren't a thing back then, but once you were out there, you were really out there. We arrived early, the sun barely peeking over the treetops. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I remember looking around and feeling a shiver run down my spine, even though it was a warm day. We set up our tent in a small clearing, had a quick lunch, and then Dad suggested a hike. We followed a trail that led us to a river, its waters crystal clear. That's when I saw it, half buried in the riverbed, a stone that glittered like a diamond. I picked it up, marveling at its beauty. It felt special, like I'd found a treasure. I showed it to Dad, who gave a low whistle. "That's quite a find, kiddo," he said, ruffling my hair. I slipped the stone into my pocket, feeling a strange connection to it. Little did I know, that simple act would set off a chain of events that would haunt us forever. As we continued our hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Forest seemed alive, but not in a comforting way. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, felt like eyes tracking our every move. The deeper we went, the darker it seemed to get, despite the sun still hanging in the sky. When we returned to our campsite, I couldn't wait to examine the stone further. It had an odd warmth to it, almost as if it were alive. The way it caught the light, casting tiny rainbows, was mesmerizing. Dad started a fire, and as the flames danced, I kept turning the stone over in my hands, feeling its smooth surface, tracing the tiny imperfections. "Time to hit the sack, buddy," Dad eventually said, yawning. I reluctantly put the stone in my backpack and crawled into the tent. The forest outside was pitch black, the dense fog starting to creep in, swallowing the world in a ghostly shroud. As I lay there, listening to the distant calls of night creatures, I felt a strange unease settle over me. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. That night, after a campfire dinner, we settled into our sleeping bags. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects and distant hoots of owls. But something felt off. As the fog thickened, the noises changed. Soft rustling, twigs snapping, and then a whisper. It started faint, almost like the wind, but grew louder. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. My heart pounded as I heard it. I wasn't dreaming. The whispers turned into a chant, an angry, accusing tone. Panic surged through me. I sat up, straining to hear more. The whisper seemed to be coming from all around us, circling our tent. I shook Dad awake, a voice trembling. "Dad, do you hear that?" He rubbed his eyes and listened. His expression shifted from groggy confusion to alarm. "What the hell?" he muttered. We both heard it now, clear as day. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. Dad grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the dense fog. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it felt like it barely made a dent. The whispers continued, louder now, almost shouting. My hands shook as I followed him outside, clutching the flashlight he handed me. "Who's there?" Dad called out, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice wavered. There was no response, just the relentless chant growing more insistent. The fog swirled around us, thick and suffocating. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree seemed to loom closer. "Dad, we need to leave," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded and we quickly started packing up, our movements frantic and clumsy. Chanting didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, angrier. It felt like the forest itself was alive, demanding we obey its rules. We stumbled through the fog, heading back to the car. Forest seemed to close in on us, branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I clutched the stone in my pocket, its warmth now a burning heat against my skin. The whispers followed us, relentless and malevolent, until we finally reached the car and sped away, the headlights piercing the darkness, not the terror that clung to us. Only when we reached the main road did the oppressive atmosphere lift. We were safe. So we thought. As the car sped away from the forest, I glanced back and saw the fog recede, but the whispers still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of the night's horrors. Back home, we tried to settle into normalcy, but the events of that night clung to us like a dark shadow. I thought leaving the forest would end our nightmare, but it was just the beginning. At first, it was subtle. Shadows in the corner of our eyes, strange noises at night. Felt like the forest had followed us, embedding itself in our lives. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again. Soft at first, barely audible, growing louder. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. I bolted upright, heart racing. The room was dark, but I felt eyes on me, unseen and unblinking. I ran to my parents' room, shaking Dad awake. "Dad, it's back!" The whispers, he looked at eyes bloodshot and tired. He heard them too. We both did. The house seemed to hum with the malevolent chant, the walls closing in, suffocating us with fear. We tried everything, lighting candles, praying, even sleeping in the same room, but nothing worked. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more insistent each night. Our home, once a place of safety, had become a prison of terror. I started to see things. Shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. Faces in the dark, watching, waiting. Dad and I became paranoid, sleep-deprived, and irritable. We snapped at each other over the smallest things. My mom, who hadn't gone on the trip, started showing signs of mental strain too. She'd wake up screaming, claiming she saw figures standing at the foot of her bed, whispering. It was as if the entity had marked us all, spreading its madness like a disease. The whispers were driving us insane. They were everywhere, in the walls, in our minds, relentless and cruel. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Every night was a battle to stay sane, to not give in to the fear that gnawed at my soul. One night, as the whispers reached a fever pitch, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke down, tears streaming down my face. "Dad, it's the stone. It's the stone I took from the forest." My voice was hoarse from screaming over the incessant chanting. "We have to return it?" Dad's eyes widened in realization. "The stone," he muttered, a mix of anger and fear. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" But there was no time for blame. We had to act. We grabbed the stone from my backpack and headed for the car, the whispers following us, growing louder and more frantic. The drive back to the forest was a blur, the darkness outside the car windows feeling like it was closing in on us. Chanting didn't stop, echoing in our heads, constant reminder of our impending doom. We had to return the stone. We had to make it stop. As we sped down the road, the fog began to rise again, and I knew the forest was waiting for us, hungry for what we had taken. The fog thickened as we neared the forest, tendrils of mist reaching out like ghostly fingers, wrapping around the car and suffocating the light from our headlights. The road seemed endless, an inky black ribbon winding into oblivion. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, an incessant chant that drilled into our minds. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. My hands shook as I clutched the stone, its heat searing through my pocket. Dad's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched in grim determination. The car seemed to crawl, time stretching and warping as we drew closer to our destination. The forest loomed ahead, a dark mass shrouded in fog, its trees like twisted sentinels guarding their domain. We parked at the edge of the trail and stepped out into the oppressive silence. The air was thick with anticipation, the fog swirling around our ankles. Every step felt heavy, as if the forest was pulling us deeper into its embrace. The whispers grew louder, chant now a roar, demanding restitution. We retraced our steps, following the same path we had taken before. The forest seemed alive, every shadow watching, every branch reaching out to snag us. I clutched the stone tightly, feeling its unnatural warmth seep into my bones. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing the relentless chant. Finally, we reached the river. The water was dark, its surface disturbed by unseen currents. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I held the stone over the water. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices screaming in my head. I took a deep breath and let the stone fall, watching as it disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The fog began to lift, the oppressive weight in the air dissipating. The forest, once menacing, now seemed almost peaceful. We stood there, panting, our breaths mingling with the cool night air. It felt like we had emerged from a nightmare. But the relief was short-lived. We hurried back to the car, eager to leave the forest behind. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. The chanting had stopped. The memory of it lingered, a ghostly echo in the back of our minds. When we finally pulled into our driveway, the house seemed welcoming, a stark contrast to the terror we had faced. But as the days passed, we realized the true extent of what we had endured. The entity might have stopped haunting us, but its presence lingered in our minds, a permanent scar on our psyches. My mom's condition worsened. She became increasingly paranoid and withdrawn, haunted by visions of shadowy figures and whispering voices. Dad and I were never the same, the fear and paranoia gnawing at us, eroding our sanity bit by bit. The forest had taken something from us, something intangible but vital. It had left a mark, an indelible stain on our souls. We had returned the stone. The cost was far greater than we could have imagined. Our lives, once ordinary and safe, had been irrevocably altered. The forest's whispers were gone, but their echo remained, a haunting reminder of the night we disturbed something ancient and vengeful. Every night, as I lay in bed, I could still feel the forest's eyes on me, watching, waiting. The darkness seemed to whisper, faintest echo of a chant that would never truly leave us. Everything from the forest must stay in the forest. If you liked this real and horrifying story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Check out this other real horror story appearing in the video. Thanks for watching.